Remember what created the market pressure for ordinary whole life in the first place: annually renewing term that became increasingly expensive as the insured aged. And now with universal life, we have brought back a mortality cost structure that behaves like that annually renewing term we had in the first place. So in a strange way, we've moved backward toward the original animal, but dressed it up in a cash value policy and classified it as quote unquote permanent life insurance.
Welcome to the Bankless by Design podcast, where we rethink money, ditch the system, and rediscover what it means to truly thrive well. I'm Trisha Miller, mom of 7, financial coach, and founder of ThriveWell. Around here, we believe wealth is more than numbers. It's about freedom, stewardship, and building a legacy that lasts. If you're ready to challenge the norm and take back control of your financial life, you're in the right place.
Hello, and welcome back to the Bankless by Design podcast. If you've been following along in our Becoming Your Own Banker series, you know that my friend and fellow practitioner Becca Wilhite joined me recently to work through the chapter Nelson Nash calls Creating the Entity. And we spent a lot of those 2 episodes talking about misclassification. And one of the key statements in this chapter is when Nelson says, the world seems to always behave that way. We pick up some screwball idea that is based on a half-truth and let it grow into a monster that blinds us to what is really happening. Later, he will also say, words are powerful things. So I think these 2 thoughts hold a lot of this chapter together, but also there's a section we actually hadn't touched yet. So I don't want to go back and repeat everything that Becca and I already covered, but I do want to briefly remind you where we landed because it's important to understanding this last part of the chapter. Nelson's background in forestry clearly shaped the way he thought about classification. He had spent a great deal of time learning that you classify things according to their major characteristics. And if you classify something incorrectly, you can begin with the wrong premise and end up with the wrong conclusion. And that's what all those strange examples Nelson gave us about potatoes and tomatoes were really all about. He tells us the Europeans went looking for gold and they discovered the potato. And at first, they thought it was poisonous and essentially useless. But eventually, it became so important that entire populations depended upon it. So Nelson's point was that they had found something incredibly valuable, but because they misunderstood what they had found, they didn't recognize its value at the time. So that was the essential argument that Nelson has made about life insurance itself. He said originally life insurance was essentially all term insurance. And the problem is that the cost kept increasing as the person grew older. So eventually the premium would become cost prohibitive. And then, of course, they would stop paying that premium. And then a few years later, they would pass away. That created a great amount of pressure from the marketplace. And the life insurance industry then decided to develop what became known as ordinary life, or what we generally call whole life insurance today. And Nelson's point is that when they made this change, they didn't merely make a small adjustment to term insurance. They actually created something very different with different characteristics. Whole life still provided a death benefit, of course, but now you had a very different premium structure. You had guaranteed cash values. The owner of the policy actually possesses an asset that continues to grow in value over time. And you could collateralize that cash value and access capital during a lifetime. With a participating whole life insurance policy, you also had the possibility of dividends being shared with the policy owner. None of those characteristics were anywhere in your original term insurance, and they still aren't today. They actually changed the entire nature of the instrument. And Nelson says it might have been better named a banking system with a death benefit thrown in for good measure. But we keep calling it life insurance. So that was the classification problem that Becca and I essentially talked about. But we stopped before Nelson actually finished the chapter. And I think it gets really interesting, so I wanted to wrap this up with you because Nelson has just spent several pages showing us what happens when we classify one thing incorrectly. And then he essentially gives us the opposite problem here at the end of the chapter. What happens when we take several very different things and put them under the same broad category and start treating them as though they're all basically the same animal? Because they're all called life insurance. And more specifically, they're all called permanent life insurance. And even that name is a bit deceptive. They are not all the same thing. Permanent does not mean whole life. And I really want to stop here because I see this confusion all the time, and understandably so. The average consumer is not a life insurance industry expert. They hear permanent life insurance and they think whole life. That's why Nelson says words are powerful things. And Becca had even mentioned in the last episode, if that is the case, why do we park on a driveway and drive on a parkway? Often our words actually have the opposite meaning. So we assume because we're told that it's permanent insurance that the guarantees are the same as they are in whole life. But that's just not so. And unfortunately, I've even heard insurance agents use this terminology incorrectly. And I've had prospective clients come to me with an existing policy, and they said, my agent told me this was whole life when they sold it to me. So they come to me truly believing that what they have is whole life. And I take a look at the policy and I have to say, I'm sorry, but it's not actually whole life. It's universal life, or it's indexed universal life, or maybe it's variable universal life. Those are not just different names for the same thing. So to clarify some of this, let me classify these very simply to the best of my ability. At the largest level, we have life insurance. And yes, Nelson would probably object to putting whole life under that label at all, but bear with me for just a minute. We can divide life insurance into two major categories: term insurance and permanent insurance. Term insurance provides death benefit protection for a specified period of time. Depending upon the product, that could be annually renewing term, or it could be a level term, or even a decreasing term, but it's for a defined number of years. This is the insurance that pays a death benefit to your family if you die during the specified term. Then, under this big umbrella of permanent life insurance, we have several different kinds of contracts as well, as the life insurance industry has changed things over time. Now, one of those is whole life insurance. In essence, whole life insurance is actually categorized under this permanent life insurance umbrella, but it is not synonymous with permanent insurance. Traditional whole life has a defined premium structure. It has contractual guarantees and guaranteed cash values and a guaranteed death benefit as long as the contractual requirements are met. And the cost of that insurance, that rising mortality cost that was in that original term insurance, has already been factored in to that level premium. So you never have to worry about that premium going up or having to pay more. So in whole life, all of the mortality assumptions, the guarantees, and the cash value development are all built together into one integrated contract. Then someone came along and said, we should unbundle it. It is not transparent enough. The average consumer doesn't understand it. Well, I'm not sure it got any better. Enter universal life. And this is a different animal. Universal life essentially unbundles some of those pieces we just talked about. And interest credits go to an account value and mortality charges and expenses come out of it. And many universal life contracts also offer some degree of premium flexibility. Then we also have indexed universal life, which came along much later. IUL, though, is still universal life. It is not whole life. What changes is the method used to determine some of the interest credits with the index. For example, these credits might be linked to the movement of an outside index, such as the S&P 500 index or what have you, through a formula. The policyholder is not literally investing the cash value, though, directly into the S&P 500 or whatever other index is referenced. And then we have variable life, where there is actual investment exposure through separate accounts. And we have variable universal life, or VUL, which combines universal life mechanics with those variable investment choices. So you can see all of these sit under the broad category of permanent life insurance. But let me say this again. permanent life insurance and whole life insurance are not synonyms. And that distinction matters because the underlying mechanics are very different. So I want you to hear what Nelson says about universal life. And this is where I want to go back to the book, because rather than me paraphrasing Nelson, listen to how he describes what happened. Nelson says, right under this new section at the very end of this chapter, my thoughts on universal life and variable life. This is Nelson's words himself. He says, universal life was invented in the early 1980s by E.F. Hutton, a stock brokerage firm that, in my opinion, knew nothing about life insurance. Remember the television commercial, when E.F. Hutton speaks, everyone listens? Now, I'm old enough to remember that, but it is interesting. I have not heard that in a long time. He says, have you heard him say anything lately? UL was nothing more than 1-year term insurance with a side fund of an interest-bearing account. It was an attempt to unbundle the savings element and the life insurance element of a whole life policy, something that can't be done if one understands the concept of whole life insurance. All right. He also goes on to say, this happened during a time of high interest rates, and it looked good in the early years of the policy. When I first saw the policy, I ran some illustrations, and he says they kept falling apart when the insured attained age 65 to 70. The cost of 1-year term became prohibitive at the advanced ages and ate up the cash fund from that point forward. Therefore, he says, I never sold one of them when I was in the business, and I surely wouldn't buy one. Now, that's strong language, but what's especially interesting to me is how this connects back to the beginning of the chapter. Remember what created the market pressure for ordinary whole life in the first place: annually renewing term that became increasingly expensive as the insured aged. And now with universal life, we have brought back a mortality cost structure that behaves like that annually renewing term we had in the first place. The fact is that the cost of insurance rises as the insured gets older. Whole life has already factored that in. Universal life has unbundled that. The difference is that now we've put an account value alongside it. So the increasing mortality cost isn't necessarily showing up as a premium bill arriving in your mailbox saying, hey, your term insurance just got more expensive. But it can be happening inside the policy without you even realizing it. So much for transparency. You see, the insurance cost still has to be paid. And if the planned premium plus the interest credited to the account isn't enough to cover the insurance costs and expenses, the account value can begin doing more and more of that work. And that's what Nelson means when he talks about the term cost is eventually eating up the cash fund. And depending upon the particular contract and its guarantees, if the account value can no longer support those charges, the owner may eventually have to put in more premium. That's when they're going to see the bill. They're either going to have to do that, they're going to have to adjust the policy downward, or risk losing the coverage altogether. So in a strange way, we've moved backward toward the original animal, but dressed it up in a cash value policy and classified it as, quote unquote, permanent life insurance. And I think that's really worth noticing. It doesn't always happen, but it can. And there's another piece of universal life that I think fits perfectly inside this section on the human problems. You see, many universal life policies give the owner flexibility in the timing or the amount of premium to be paid. And that flexibility can sound really wonderful, certainly enticing. Sometimes flexibility can be very, very helpful. But flexibility in human behavior can also be dangerous in combination. So if I'm told you can pay this much premium, but you don't necessarily have to, what do human beings tend to do? Well, we tend to pay the minimum. Money's a little tight this year or this month, and we'll catch up with it later. And the policy seems fine anyways. Why would I want to put more into it than I have to? And for quite a while, that might be okay. The policy's still in force. And there might even still be some account value. Nothing appears to be wrong, but the policy charges haven't stopped. You're going to continue to get older. And depending upon the product, the cost of that insurance is going to continue rising. And then years later, someone discovers that there's actually far less cash value than they expected, or suddenly they need substantially more premium to keep the policy functioning the way that they thought it would. And I've seen this in real life, and it's a very sad affair. And I think it is one of the reasons why the life insurance industry can get a bad name. After all, people put thousands of dollars in these things over the lifetime, and then they hit age 75 or maybe 80, and they think they're going to have some cash value in there or a death benefit, and suddenly they don't. They thought it was permanent insurance. So I've had people bring me policies that they believed were whole life, and we look at the in-force illustration. Sometimes even the guaranteed ledger shows that the planned premium isn't sufficient to keep the policy in force for life under those guaranteed assumptions. Now, I want to be careful here. That does not mean that the policy is definitely going to lapse. The premium alone is not guaranteed to keep that policy in force for life. So in order for the policy to perform better than that, either the actual results have to be better than those guaranteed assumptions, or the owner might actually have to put in more money. If I owned that kind of policy, I'd want to know that, but many don't. And this is where indexed universal life comes into the conversation. And IUL wasn't what Nelson was actually addressing on this particular page. It developed later, but it does belong in our classification because people are often sold IUL today as though it is basically another version of whole life. And it isn't. IUL is still indexed universal life. It's still under the universal life family. The interest crediting method has just changed. Instead of traditional declared interest by the company, certain credits may be determined using the performance of an outside index and a contractual formula involving things like caps, spreads, or floors, etc. And I don't want to get into all the details there, but we haven't turned universal life with indexed universal life into whole life. The universal life mechanics are still underneath it. There is still an account value and policy charges. It's been unbundled. And in my view, it's actually become far more complicated for the average consumer to understand than whole life in the first place. That cost of insurance still has to be funded. Nelson has just spent an entire chapter telling us that we must classify the thing that we're looking at first. What is producing those numbers? What is actually guaranteed? What are the assumptions? And maybe most importantly, who is bearing the risk? Those are the questions that matter. Now, let's go back to the book again, because on the top of page 39, he says, lastly, there came variable life, invented by Equitable Life Assurance Society. It was nothing more, again, than 1-year term insurance with a side fund, but this time of a mutual fund. There are more mutual funds than there are stocks. No mutual fund is any better than its manager. The great preponderance of mutual fund managers have never seen a downturn in the market until the recent one. Obviously, this has got a historical time frame to this book. But he's basically saying there's a volatility here. You're putting it in a stock market. You're putting it in this mutual fund, and it's at risk, and it's depending on the manager of that fund. It's depending on the market. You've basically tried to combine a life insurance product with an investment and let life insurance be life insurance. And I do think it is important. Here again, this is where we have to all do our own due diligence. We have to be willing to read. The arrival syndrome is at work here. We think we know, but we really don't know. And it is a good idea to get our own education. If it's your lifetime earnings you're talking about, or if it's your legacy that you're going to leave to your loved ones in the future, it's important that we understand these things. Okay, his second to last paragraph is interesting because he says, I was with Equitable Life when variable life came on the scene. Again, I never sold one of those policies, and I would never buy one. I do not recommend its use for the infinite banking concept. So, if you happen to be with your book in front of you and a pen, I would highly recommend you underline that sentence in the book. I do not recommend its use for the infinite banking concept. That's pretty clear. Variable life introduces actual investment risk to the policyholder through those separate accounts. And variable universal life combines that investment exposure with that universal life structure. Again, same broad category, permanent life insurance, but a very different animal from whole life insurance. And this is also why I think people need to understand the position of the Nelson Nash Institute. Nelson wasn't simply saying any cash value life insurance will work, just pick one. He was very particular about the characteristics that he wanted in the tool that is going to be used to perform the banking function in your life. He believed dividend-paying whole life was the appropriate tool for implementing the infinite banking concept, and NNI maintains that standard today. If someone comes to me specifically wanting to practice the infinite banking concept, I cannot put that person into an IUL, a VUL, or any other life insurance product and market that as IBC. The practitioner guidelines require us to use only dividend-paying whole life insurance for someone seeking to implement the infinite banking concept. A practitioner who fails to follow that guideline can actually lose his or her authorized practitioner designation. That does not mean that NNI is saying that there's no other form of life insurance that should ever be used for any purpose for anyone. That is not the point. Someone might have another objective for which a different product is being considered, but don't call it the infinite banking concept merely because the policy has cash value and a loan provision. And why is that? Why is dividend paying whole life the best tool for the infinite banking concept? Well, I think it takes us right back to the major characteristics. With dividend paying whole life, the fundamental guarantees of the contract are not dependent on a side account producing enough interest to keep up with an annually increasing mortality charge. Policy lapsing doesn't depend upon receiving some particular illustrated dividend every year. It's a very different allocation of risk. And if Nelson is looking for a place where he's going to warehouse his capital and repeatedly access it throughout his lifetime for the process of banking, then that distinction becomes very important. I know for me, I'm looking for a place where if I'm going to put the vast majority of the capital in my life and I'm going to conduct my banking with it, well, then I surely want to make sure that I have guaranteed access to it throughout a lifetime and that it's not going away. This is extremely important. I don't want anything short of guaranteed growth or guaranteed access to capital in my banking system. All right. This brings me to the very last sentence in this section. Nelson says, "The tragedy of our times is that the life companies never spent any time on understanding dividend-paying whole life insurance and teaching the buying public its characteristics." Listen carefully to that order. He says they failed to spend any time on understanding. He's talking about the life insurance companies themselves. And if the people creating, managing, and distributing these products don't fully understand the characteristics of what they had, after all, they're still calling it life insurance, then how in the world were they going to teach the buying public to understand those principles? And honestly, when I think back to the Nelson's potato story, this almost feels like the same exact tragedy. It's like starving in a field full of food because somebody convinced you that the potatoes were poisonous. The problem isn't that the resource isn't there. The problem is that you don't recognize what you have. And isn't that exactly Nelson's point? Here we have this financial instrument, but because we've been told it's life insurance, we don't see it as a financial system capable of taking over the banking function in our lives. So we think it's just expensive life insurance. So meanwhile, most of us spend our entire lives going outside ourselves for the banking function. We go and ask banks for permission to access some capital. We pay them lots of interest. We accept their terms, and we organize our entire financial lives around the system. I was even thinking this when it comes to your FICO score. We all get a score of whether or not we are performing well enough to have access to that capital. Well, when we have our own banking system, do we even need a FICO score? If we need some third-party bank along the way, perhaps we do. But I'm just saying it emphasizes this idea of how much we organize our lives around someone else's system. All the while, this more beneficial system has been sitting here in plain sight, and it's completely overlooked. We don't see it. Why? Because we've classified it as expensive life insurance. And that's why I think Nelson calls this such a tragedy. The tragedy is that we have an extraordinarily useful tool sitting right in front of us. But because we don't understand its characteristics, we don't recognize how valuable it really is and what we have at our fingertips to be used to grow our wealth, to give us that tailwind, to be a tool for freedom, for creating opportunity, for solving problems, for being able to care for the ones that we love and give generously, and for passing possibility onto the generations that come after us. And that's where I think I want to leave this creating the entity today. Nelson's challenge is really just a challenge to see clearly, to rethink our thinking, to classify things by what they actually are, not simply by what we've been told to call them. All right. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for joining me. And until next time, have a fantastic rest of your week.
Thanks for tuning in to the Bankless by Design podcast, where we're done with the system and we're doing money differently. Be sure to subscribe, share this episode with someone who needs it, and visit us at banklessbydesign.com to learn how you can start living bankless by design.